A very good afternoon, one and all. A huge welcome to each one of you to the event Invisible Selves, Insights into Mental Health. On behalf of the YFlow chairperson, Ms. Pallavi Jain, and her committee, I, Akanksha Agarwal, YFlow secretary, would like to extend a very warm welcome to our esteemed guests of honor, Mrs. Neerja Birla and Ms. Shoma Chaudhary. Our distinguished past chairs, Ms. Maurya Boda, Ms. Rekha Lahoti, Ms. Ajita Yogesh, Ms. Mansi Malik, Ms. Aarti Shah, Ms. Riddhi Jain, Ms. Nidhi Swaroop, Ms. Manjula Reddy, our incoming national president for the year 2027-28, Ms. Kamini Saraf, sponsors, press, media, and our members. I request everybody please rise for the national anthem.
जन गण मन अधिनायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता पंजाब सिंध गुजरात मराठा द्राविड उत्कल बंगा विंध्य हिमाचल यमुना गंगा उच्चल जलधि तरंगा तव शुभ नामे जागे तव शुभ आशीष मांगे गाहे तव जय गाथा जन गण मंगलदायक जय हे भारत भाग्य विधाता जय हे जय हे जय हे जय 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 हे
I kindly request YFlow chairperson Ms. Pallavi Jain, Ms. Pratibha Kunda, our guests of honor, to join us for the lighting of the lamp. I request Mrs. Neerja Birla, Flow and YFlow past chairs, along with Ms. Pallavi Jain and Ms. Pratibha Kunda, to join us for a picture. Flow and YFlow office bearers are also requested to be ready for the next picture. Thank you for your patience. I invite YFlow chairperson Ms. Pallavi Jain to address the gathering.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is an absolute privilege to welcome you all to Invisible Selves, a conversation that holds deep relevance in our times. Mental health is not a luxury anymore. It is a necessity. In our roles as women, professionals, mothers, and nurturers, we carry invisible responsibilities, emotions, and expectations that often go unspoken. It is time we bring these to light because to learn, to grow, and to conquer, we must first understand ourselves with honesty and compassion. As someone who has studied in a Birla institution, I feel a deep sense of connection and gratitude in welcoming Mrs. Birla today, a leader whose work has illuminated countless lives through her advocacy for mental wellness and education. The motto of my school, Tamso Ma Jyotirgamay, from darkness, lead me to light, could not be more fitting for today. This platform, Invisible Selves, is about that very journey, moving from silence to conversation, from stigma to understanding, and from awareness to empowerment. A heartfelt thank you to Mrs. Birla for joining us and lending her voice to this very important dialogue on mental health, and to Ms. Shoma Chaudhary, our moderator and curator of this conversation, which I think will go in great depth and sincerity. I truly believe that today's session will help each one of us see mental health not as an individual concern, but as a shared responsibility, one that begins with awareness, empathy, and the courage to speak. Thank you all for being here today, and let us together continue to learn, grow, and conquer. Thank you.
Thank you, Pallavi. Some personalities truly need no introduction. Their work, their impact, their vision speak far louder than words. Mrs. Birla is one such inspiring leader, a force of purpose, compassion, and change. We welcome you here today, ma'am. Mrs. Neerja Birla, founder and chairperson, Aditya Birla Education Trust, is a distinguished global leader, an unwavering advocate for mental health, and a trailblazer in the realm of inclusive education. She is fueled by a profound sense of purpose and an unwavering commitment to the spirit of service. As the founder of Empower, Mrs. Birla has redefined mental health in India. Reaching over 180 million people, Empower has become South Asia's largest and most influential private entity focused on mental health, literacy, capacity building, and community outreach. Driven by her deep commitment to education, she established the Aditya Birla World Academy and the Aditya Birla Integrated School, both of which have set new benchmarks for distinction and diversity. Through ABEA, she has empowered over 6 lakh educators across India and Asia, providing them the tools and skills to enhance educational outcomes. As passionate champion for women's health and empowerment, she pioneered Ujas, an initiative designed to eliminate menstrual stigma, combat period poverty, and promote reproductive health awareness. We are honored to have you with us today. I request Mrs. Birla to come on stage, and I request Ms. Pallavi Jain to felicitate Mrs. Birla with a small token of appreciation. Events team, can we get the memento and the green certificate? I'd like to announce that under our green initiative for 2025-26, we are planting trees on behalf of each of our guest speakers. It gives me immense pleasure to introduce our next guest for today, Ms. Shoma Chaudhary. Ms. Chaudhary is an award-winning journalist, editor, and founder of Lucid Lines, an independent platform dedicated to creating high-credibility spaces for dialogue, debate, and discovery. Recognized by Newsweek among the 150 women who shake the world. Isn't that fantastic? She has been honored with the Ernest Hemingway Award, the Ramnath Goenka Award, and the Chameli Devi Award for going where angels fear to tread. A dynamic speaker and moderator, she has hosted over 1,000 on-stage conversations with some of the world's most influential thinkers and change makers through her events Synapse, Ignition, and Inquiry. Earlier, as a co-founder of Tehelka and Think, she has redefined Indian journalism, leading fearless investigative reporting and curating platforms that brought together global icons from politics, media, science, and arts. Tina Brown, former editor of The New Yorker, describes her as the best convener of conversations in the world and a powerful instrument of challenge and persuasion in India's public life. We are honored to have you with us today. I request Ms. Chaudhary to please come on stage. Over to you, Ms. Chaudhary.
Thank you so much, Pallavi, and thank you, Ficky Flo, Y-Flow, for having us here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you very much, Nija, for taking the time and trouble to come. As all of you have said, this really is a very, very important and significant conversation, something very pertinent to all of us individually and then to the many concentric circles of love and relationships within which we live. I would share just one or two very quick statistics about the sheer scale of the phenomenon of mental health issues that we are talking about. But I think much more than the statistics, we're all aware that this is an escalating epidemic, silent pandemic, I would say, that, at one degree of separation, we encounter people who are suffering from it. And it's really a very, very significant conversation to have. Just, as I said, a couple of statistics which will bring home how important the issue is that right here in India, 1 out of 4 children in the teenage group from 9 to 16 have tried self-harm or committed suicide. We account for almost 20% of global mental health conditions. And according to the WHO, between 10 to 15% of Indians are suffering from one or the other spectrum of mental health issues. So like I said, these are really startling statistics, but much more importantly is the personal experience of this. And that's why it's really, really impactful to have Nija here today. And Nija, I'd like to, even before coming to the vast canvas of work you're doing, I wanted to start with your own personal experience of mental health crisis and what triggered you actually to get involved in this issue. I think from the outside, the fact that, you're wealthy, you're accomplished, you've been born into a privileged situation makes one blind to the fact that you too could possibly have a mental health crisis. So do share your personal experience with us.
So good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's always very nice to speak to the Ficky Flo and the women section, and I just find it sort of very motivating for me also to talk to like-minded women. So thank you so much for having me, and thanks so much, Shoma. It's always lovely to talk to you too. So coming to your question about mental health, I think that is one of the biggest myths that I had to grapple with, and people like us grapple with all the time, is that one often thinks of a mental health illness, sort of an illness only which doesn't happen to the people of privilege, which is the biggest myth, because I think mental health and illness doesn't discriminate. It can happen to anybody, any age, gender, economic strata, and the work that we do actually shows us that, because we have people coming in from, in our urban centers, people coming in who are from very privileged backgrounds, and in our foundations, we have people coming in from the lowest strata of society who obviously cannot even afford treatment. So we do see an entire spectrum of people coming, and I think coming to your question about my lived experience, so I think all of us have some lived experience to mental illness, and my daughter went through her bout of mental illness, and that was the first time that I sort of really grappled with it, because back then, the awareness was just not there. And I call myself educated illiterate because, it really took me by surprise. And I realized that if, after having all the resources, if one has to grapple with it because of lack of awareness, lack of support from anybody, because people just didn't know what was happening, people didn't want to talk about it. I was not supposed to talk about it to anybody. And then here I was trying to figure out what is happening, trying to get the doctors, and it was just such a difficult time that as a caregiver, I realized that if we could be having issues like that, people at large would also be needing help. And that was a trigger for me to get into it. And I also realized that, before that, I went through tryst with postpartum depression, which lasted for a very short time. But while it lasted, again, it was very difficult. And, but the second time around, you're so much smarter, you're aware about it, and that helped me deal with it so much better. So I think, putting all these pieces together, I realized that this was my way of also sort of healing in a sense, because if you feel that if your experiences can help other people, so why not?
So, Nisha, again, before telescoping out to your public work, I just want to stay a little bit more with the personal experience because it'll resonate so much with everyone else's lived experience. So, starting with your daughter, and again, that's a realm all of us grapple with, is that what were the symptoms, and I think that's, again, something very crucial to recognize, like you said, to first even be aware that something is happening, and how do you distinguish that this is something which requires either intervention, medical intervention? Is it just something to be like, jostle your child to like get on with it? So do share with us what happened with Ananya. What was the symptom?
So actually that's exactly what happens, that, a lot of times, and I think for us also, I think for any one of us who's going through a mental illness or anybody in the family or in your close circle, a lot of times, because it's a broad spectrum, even if you take something like fatigue, for example, you may feel fatigue on a daily basis and you just think that it's, really nothing to be looked into. I think the discrimination needs to come in as when does it need intervention? So I think when it comes in the way of your daily living is when it needs to be looked into more seriously. So for example, if you are not able to, just say if your child is not able to wake up in time, and it's not just a one-off, but if it's something that happens continuously over weeks, or if she's not wanting to step out of the room, or if your son was always very fond of sport, for example, and is suddenly just not wanting to interact with people, or is just not wanting to, go back and play his sport, and that happens continuously, then that's a red flag and needs to be looked into. So anything which becomes and comes in the way of your daily life is something that needs to be looked into and would certainly need intervention. And when I mean intervention, I don't mean only pharmacology. I don't mean only medication. It could be intervention as to just seeking help, going out to a therapist and talking about it, or at least just talking about it to your immediate circle, and not just coping with it silently. It doesn't need to be coped with silently.
So Nisha, just again about this moving from unknowing to knowing, when it first happened with Ananya, can you help us chart what may have been, first blind spots in you, and then like how did the needle shift? When did you become, like you've said that yes, an inability to even be functional through your normal daily routine. That's a stark, example. But in your response to it, first as a mother, anxiety, over intervention, whatever it might be, can you help us run through how you reacted and then how did that become a mature response?
So I think like all of us moms, our first response is, it's okay, it's going to be okay, or, get up and let's get on with the day. But you obviously that's your first response, and that's most natural. Your first thing is you're not going to first jump into saying, okay, my daughter is or my son is going through anxiety or depression, and therefore I need to get to a doctor. So your first response is, come on, get on with the day, step out of the room, let's carry on with whatever activity you're supposed to carry on. But I think it's something that then evolves because you realize that, that this is not normal. It's not normal to, or it's not within a normal. I don't mean to say that mental illness is abnormal. It just is, and something that needs to be worked around and navigated. So when I'm saying normal means it's not okay to just be in bed and not wanting to get out, for days that end. So I think it's something that just evolves and you realize that, no, this is something which really needs to look into. And I don't want to put, it's very difficult to put days to it because everybody's journey is very different. So I think it just depends on how each parent looks at it. But as a parent, you need to understand that what is not within the purview of normal for your child. And then you sort of need to definitely step into it and sort of act on it.
So did you struggle with the articulation of it? You were sharing earlier that there's this stigma or, hesitance to even tell your first circle of friends or loved ones. Did you face that in yourself? And then was there a trigger that made you feel, I'm okay to talk about it? And then how did you begin to talk about it?
So definitely it was very difficult to talk about it because first it was that, the first point was that first I had to understand what was going on. I understood that something is not right, but what was it, that took me a while to understand it. And obviously, even the child back then, because the awareness was so low, like now things have changed because now children themselves also understand that something is not right and they're able to articulate it better. But, so many years back, that also was difficult. So, first to understand what was happening first, and then to ask her to be able to express it, that was difficult. Then when I understood what was happening, then to even break it to the immediate family was just very tough because there was, that was also not being accepted, that no, there is nothing, it's going to be okay. Why do we need to show it to X, Y, and Z? Or why do we need to take her to another doctor? So all those are sort of stumbling blocks, right? And that only happens because the stigma is so much. I mean, let's compare it to dengue, for example, or let's compare it to a fracture. The minute you know there is fever, firstly it's measurable, so you're able to measure the fever. You instantly get to a doctor. You're instantly doing blood tests, and okay, the diagnosis, there's dengue and there is medication. It's that clear cut, and it's a matter of days before you're getting to treatment. But with mental illness, it's that whole journey itself is so difficult because you can't measure it, there's no yardstick, there's no way to test it, and then when you're sort of grappling with it, then to get to the doctor, who's the right doctor, all those are such gray areas. Back then it was much worse. Even now I think it's still difficult. It's not as clear cut as a physical health condition. So, but so these are sort of things that one has to navigate, and it'll only happen if you're aware about it, if you're willing to talk to people about it. Only then will you be able to get help for it.
So, Nija, I'm going to come back to your own experience because, there are two constituencies of concern here. One is children, one is ourselves as women. And then, of course, all male partners, and it keeps cascading outwards. So I'm going to come back to that. But since we've begun to talk about children more, and I want to again come back to the individual experience. But first, just now that you're working publicly and, at a large scale with mental health issues, are there sort of, common triggers that is now becoming easier to spot? Like, are there particular kinds of triggers that can tip you over into just having a rough time to actually becoming a mental health situation? Do you have
very often in school we see that if there is consistent bullying that is happening, and bullying can be really rough, from just simple bullying to saying to, and actually it's wrong of me to say simple bullying because there can be nothing as simple bullying. What I meant is that bullying, like say in, calling somebody fat or thin, or or commenting on the dressing, these are all forms of bullying. To, like say cyberbullying, where images are being morphed, wrong or inappropriate videos are being shared. Now things like that can have a huge and a deep impact on children, and we see that very often in school, where the impact and the outcome of this bullying can lead to severe mental health illnesses. It could, and when I say severe, it could be like starting from like depression to being very, very suicidal, because it can be so bad that the child then refuses to come to school, goes through a lot of social anxiety, there is so much isolation, doesn't feel good enough, and that, can eventually lead to like suicidal ideation, and if then again not corrected, can land up where the child actually takes his life or her life.
So, you said bullying. So, Nija, just earlier I was chatting with one of the members, and I think this is a common concern across now, which is that how do you know, and is there any playbook that you have arrived at for yourself, that how much do you know when to, like, as you said, like jostle a child, for that you need resilience. And in this generation, like our generation, it was still stigma. Now there's so much talking about it at one level in certain social strata that young people have started to almost scorn mental health. They keep saying, oh, it's fashionable, everyone's depressed, everyone's seeing a therapist. So is there, again, speaking for yourself, a kind of playbook of when to create resilience in your child to be able to withstand hardship and adversity, and when it's just like become a default mode to say, I'm depressed? And so is there any way to navigate this minefield?
No. The honest answer is no. As a parent, it's very difficult to find that right balance. And I think, I think it's probably just about taking each incident and each sort of time and each situation as it comes. Because what I'm applying in one situation may not be applicable to another.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to have like a standardization that, you know, up to this point, you sort of ignore it up to this point, and if only, you know, ABC triggers are seen, then you get into action. I think that's very difficult to do. One has to sort of take each situation because, and again, I think you have to be present with your child. And when I say present, I don't only mean physically present, I mean emotionally present,
I think
emotionally available to understand what the child is going through and gauge from that, that whether, you know, and you are the best, I mean, being a parent, you're the best judge to intuitively know that also, that when is the child just playing truant and just trying to, you know, take an easy way out, and when is the child really suffering. And I think if you're able to be emotionally present and aware of that, you'll be able to address every situation as it arises.
I think that's a really, you know, and that's a point that actually could be a playbook for everyone, to be very present and aware and not actually chasing a stereotype of how to be with your child, you know.
And also because every child, and I think that's what I've also learned, is that having 3 kids and at 3 very different phases in life, for them as well as for me, because the kind of parent that I was, say, to my firstborn when, say, she was 18, and the parent that I was when, say, my secondborn was 18, and the parent that I was when my thirdborn was 18, was very different. So each child was also very different at the same age, and I was very different as a parent because I had my own trajectory and my own journey as a parent, as an individual, as a woman. So therefore, it's very difficult to have that one playbook. But I think the commonality between all 3, for me, I think now when I look back, is that I was just emotionally and physically present with each one of them through their journey. So no matter what I was going through, because I was going through my own churns as well, right? But just being aware, I think, and being emotionally present with them and trying to kind of understand what each one was going through is what I think is helping.
Yeah. So I just want to switch gear a bit. You know, like you said, that you were personally going through a journey as a woman as well. And this is a hall full of women grappling with their own dilemmas. So we'll again come to the public sort of phenomenon. But speaking for yourself, Neerja, I want to come back to that you had postpartum depression. You know, again, that's like a double whammy for you because you're privileged and then you're in this, you've had a baby, you're supposed to be, you know, like the picture of joy and motherhood. And instead you're having depression, you know. So talk to us about that phase as a woman. And again, what gave you courage to speak up? In what context did you finally be able to express yourself? You know, what were the challenges during that time?
So it was extremely challenging, actually. And, you know, strangely, while I was going through it, of course, then it sounds really strange, but I didn't even know a term like postpartum depression existed. I had no idea at all. So I didn't even know a term existed, therefore I didn't even know a condition like that can happen. So it really hit me by surprise. It really hit me like a thunderbolt. And again, therefore it becomes so important for professionals also to speak about it, because even my gynac didn't tell me, the pediatrician didn't tell me, nothing, right? At least now it's important, and at least gynacs are talking to you about it. They're saying that, okay, this can happen. And obviously now even the self-awareness is much more. But back then there was nothing, and it just suddenly, you know, hit upon me, and I was just wondering what was happening. And exactly this, you're supposed to be happy, or, you know, supposed to really enjoy your child. Of course, I really enjoyed my child, but there was always this overhang of a low mood that just stayed. And it, you know, luckily for me, fortunately, it passed by very quickly. And I only realized what I went through when I was expecting my second. Because by then people had started talking about it, and then my gynac told me that this can happen. And then I said that, yes, oh my God, this is what happened to me after my first was born. Then the second time around, I was much better prepared for it. You know, and by the third, of course, I mean, I was okay. I was able to I knew what to expect, I knew how to deal with it, and it just became so much easier. And just very recently, a friend's daughter was just telling me about how she had postpartum depression. Her child is now 4, and her postpartum lasted for a whole year. And she said, I just could not enjoy my child. But she knew what was happening to her, and therefore it just made her journey that much easier to navigate. So it doesn't take away what you feel, because you still feel what you feel, but it is just easier to navigate those emotions.
So, for most women, it's very hard to, because again, everyone is trapped in that you're a caregiver, whether you're a homemaker or you've got a professional identity. So, again, I'm loath to ask you to give advice because, like you said, everyone's journey on this is very personal. But using your own experience, if there was something you could share with the audience as women, that when you're struggling with something like this, what becomes that trigger to speak up? When do you not speak up? When do you speak up? And in your case, was your husband sort of sensitive about it? Or even in your first circle, were people a bit blind to you? What was your...
See, honestly, I think, like I'm saying, because the awareness was just so less that time, that firstly, I was also not aware of it. So, for example, just a simple thing, like say, in the evenings, anybody who's gone through postpartum or who has been, who's had a depressive illness would know that, evenings just becomes a very difficult time to go through. So every evening I just had this overhang of a very low mood, and I just could not understand why, because, okay, there are days when when you're young, when your child is an infant, is say having colic, right? And you're just finding it difficult to deal with. But there are days when she's okay and you're not really supposed to be feeling low, but you still have that overhang and you don't know why you're feeling what you're feeling. And you don't even, but it's important to speak up, which I didn't, because I just felt that, you're not supposed to be feeling low. So there's that stigma that is attached to it, and, you're almost ashamed to even say it. So you don't speak up about it. So during that time, I actually didn't speak up about it. I just kind of endured it silently, which is what I'm saying, that you should not be doing it. And had I known, I would have spoken up about it. But I just felt that you almost feel guilty to feel low, and then you don't want to acknowledge it, right?
Yeah. So in this kind of invisibility, are there others, again, now I'm shifting to the fact that you've been a mental health advocate now and you're doing a tremendous amount of work, and I want to come to that. But when we're talking about invisibility, one is this, postpartum, such a stereotype, you're supposed to be joyous, but whether it's menstrual health, whether it's trouble with, do you have a sense of the spectrum of invisibilities that a room full of women like this could be facing?
Yeah,
What would you?
all the time, and I think the newest one being perimenopause and menopause. I think that's a huge one that we all struggle with. And again, for the longest time ever, one doesn't know, about perimenopause, but the awareness is much less than what it should be. And I think just even reading up about it, talking about it, just helps you put labels to what you're feeling, and that kind of acknowledges your emotions and just helps you navigate it better, because then you realize it's not in your head. The minute you're sort of validating it and giving it a name, then you realize it's not in your head, and that it takes away that invisibility, just makes it visible. It first makes it visible to yourself, and then you're able to talk about it and then help make it visible to others as well. So I remember the first time years ago when a friend of mine and I spoke about it, and we were both hesitating to talk about what we're feeling, because I think we both felt that, oh my God, we're not supposed to be feeling, say, brain fog. And, we started talking about it, and we both said, yeah, that's exactly what I feel. And that moment was such a liberating moment, because I was able to acknowledge it feeling to myself, she was able to acknowledge it to her, and we both realized that it was very personal, but yet a very shared experience. So, did it take away the brain fog? No, it's still very much there, but it just helped validate that feeling. So similarly, I think that applies to all the different aspects of perimenopause that we experience, right? Whether it's on the physical level, much more on the emotional level, the cognitive level, the physiological level, all of it.
Yeah.
So,
I think this thing you said about sisterhood makes such a difference. You know, I just wanted to share one quick story that I was at an art exhibition once and we all came out, someone invited us to a restaurant. So I got into a SUV full of 7 women who I did not know at all, you know. And within the first minute, Nirja, I'm not exaggerating, all of us were discussing what's happening to our bodies, you know, like inflammation, thyroid, cholesterol, brain fog, like, and that's, we all burst into this conversation and then this sisterhood formed and you suddenly, exactly like you said, realize this is not alone, that there are others suffering, and it just became naturalized and normal to talk about it, you know. So I think, again, Madhavi was sharing with us that here in Hyderabad, it's not yet very natural to discuss, for women to discuss that they're going through menopause or to talk about their problems. And, you know, like Nirja talking so naturally about it, I hope it makes that space to open up and talk and begin to acknowledge this, you know.
I think it's, I mean, it is, I mean, half the population is either going through it or will go through it. And it's the most natural transition of our life. And if you ask me, I think it's one of the most difficult ones. So I think it's only fair to ourselves to definitely acknowledge it yourself. First, I think that's where we women sort of falter. You know, we don't give ourselves that much importance and don't give our emotions that much importance to talk about it. So, I mean, at home with me, with my children, with all 3 of them, including my son, it's the most normal conversation. And in fact, just as a joke, I want to just share it. So, you know, I kind of put everything on the hormones. So I'm just always
on the hormones.
on the hormones. You know, and so we were just walking, my son and I, somewhere, and we walked, you know, through a bookstore, and there was a book on perimenopause. And he said, "That's the one for you. I think I need to pick it up for myself." So he, you know, so what I'm saying is that you have to talk about it, because until we don't talk about it, how would the other person also know, right? If we ourselves lack awareness, how do we expect our families to even know about it, let alone be supportive?
Right. But you know, Nirja, I'll come back to that dilemma that I think a lot of women might face in their own families or societally. One is to talk about it, and there's no argument over the fact that we all need to open up much more. But do you think that there's a kind of reverse whiplash where when you begin to talk about this phenomenon, you again get pigeonholed as, oh, women are chemical beings, you know, irrational, emotional, hormonal, you know.
Yeah.
So is there some of that? And then
That is.
how did you come to your sthirta about that?
No, but there is. I just faced it a couple of days ago, and I got really upset with this group of friends. So it's there, but you know, it's a trade-off, and everything in life is a trade-off. You either decide not to talk about it and just go through it like an invisible struggle, then in any case, you're really struggling hard. Or you decide to talk about it, but also know that there will be groups of people who will probably, you know, put it back that, oh, it's just in your head. You're just kind of, you know, under the garb of perimenopause, a lot of things are just sort of taken for granted, and you. So it's a trade-off, but then, you know, you'd rather deal with at least majority of people being supportive and deal with the few people who are not supportive. But that's what life is, but that's
Right.
what it is. I mean, it's too difficult to expect that everyone's going to understand it, but then you're at least better off with at least 70% of people understanding it and only 25% not.
That's true. You know, I'm going to come to Empower, but before that, since you've been articulating this so much, has there been a shift, say, in, you know, Mr. Birla or first circles of friends, particularly male friends, because you're a woman who's like, you know, articulating this on a public scale,
Yeah.
national scale?
Most certainly. I definitely
What's
think
the changes there?
Because exactly this, I think, just getting them aware that, you know, what are the different changes that the body goes through. And I think they definitely understand it more. I think the respect goes up more. And, you know, they're not scoffing it off now, which earlier either they were not talking about it or just saying, beware of her, because, not for me, I mean, just generally, beware of her because, you know, it's one of those days, or she's just going through a huge hormonal shift. So you don't scoff it off like that. And, you know, so I think they are a little bit, I mean, they're definitely more careful and they would not say that anymore.
Yeah. I think very often when women are asserting themselves and making an emphatic point, then that can be discussed as a hormonal moment also, so it's like a whole minefield.
It is.
But coming to Empower, Nirja, talk to us about the sheer scale, and in that, again, some deep insights that you have got about now at a national scale, the canvas of mental health issues and what are the challenges there?
I think so. We've been working in this for 10 years now, and we've sort of covered the gamut of, starting from awareness to encouraging people to seek help, to providing clinical care, to doing a lot of outreach and capacity building. And now we're also getting into actually providing capacity building and training for psychologists and psychiatrists. So I think we started with awareness because the awareness was really lacking back then, as we've spoken, encouraging people to seek help. And the shift that we're seeing now, and hugely, is that people are willing to seek help. People are seeking help. People are willing to go to therapists. And I find that even in conversations, just regular social conversations also, people are more upfront about it, are willing to talk about, one of their loved ones needing help. So where do you go? How do you navigate it? Who's the doctor to go to? These sort of conversations were definitely not happening back then. And we're seeing this change even coming about in colleges and schools that we're working in, where the youth are definitely more open to seeking help. They're wanting to seek help. They're wanting to get better. And very often, the college students are grappling with their parents not being open to it. So what we find is that getting all stakeholders involved in that conversation is very, very helpful, because at school you have to have the teachers involved in it, but in colleges you also need to get the parents, and even in schools you have to get the parents involved, because then that becomes a difficult point, because very often the students are willing to seek help, but the parents are not that supportive. So a couple of times we've had in our foundations, we've had students come in because they don't want their parents are not willing to support them, they're not willing to provide them with the funds to take help, to take therapy. And they can't afford it, so then, but they still want the help. So we obviously give it to them. So that's a little bit of a sort of a gap that we still need to fill, is how do we get parents on board and let their children seek help when they themselves are wanting to seek help.
I just wanted to share with the audience that Empower, Nirja's, the trust through which she's creating this mental health awareness across the country, is now working in 10 states and with like 700 team, working with the CRPF, CISF, and then in rural areas with those who can't access and don't have the financial bandwidth to access. So that's really a fantastic canvas of work, Nirja.
Thank you. And with the CISF, of course, we're in all the states. So because we man all the airports, where we're providing not only mental health counseling, but we're also training the staff on mental health literacy, where all the personnel, we're training the superiors how to be able to create safe spaces. We're trying to create an environment, an ecosystem of care and empathy, so that seeking mental health care becomes that much easier.
Great. So Nisha, I just want to double down again on this dilemma, even for women here. This internal dialogue that should I cope or should I speak? And speak not just like for help. Obviously, if you can't move, you're not being able to get up, those are still symptoms. But a more gray zone, I've just recently had sharing a very personal, my closest friend lost her 19-year-old to suicide. And, because they kept mistaking it, because he was going through a difficult period, otherwise a sports star, and like everything was fine with him. And they were focusing on getting him to get into a new college. It was just a difficult summer. And he wasn't expressing it either, So it wasn't that he was not functioning. And like I was saying with many women too, it may be that you feel like I should cope with this, I should cope with this. So are there any symptoms, or Amir Khan says just go for therapy anyway, like once a week go see a therapist, because you may not be having a mental health issue, you may be dealing with anger, with, just conflict, so just go talk to a therapist. So in this broad canvas, this dilemma of should I deal with it or should I make this everybody's problem? What are what are symbols for it?
I think that both can coexist. So I feel that, yes, I mean, just coming to the, about your friend, what you spoke, is exactly what I was saying earlier on, is that, it's very easy because you're a highly functioning individual who could be dealing with high depression. How much do you push yourself? And as parents, I think we have to just understand that how much is enough, when do you sort of step in? And that is a very difficult and fine balance. And the only way to deal with it is just to create your own awareness and be emotionally present at all
For
times.
yourself also.
For yourself also, and for your child. I think the other thing that I think women sort of are dealing with is a lot of trauma. And when I say trauma, I don't mean, it doesn't have to mean trauma that comes out of, we traditionally think of trauma that comes out of something very, very bad, But trauma can be something that you're dealing with on a daily basis, which just even comes from some childhood experiences. Trauma is what is your response to a situation, right? And it could be a trauma for you and for me could be very different, the situation being the same, because I may have reacted to it, responded to it very differently, and you have responded to it very differently. But what you're left with feeling is the trauma that you're dealing with. And so I think, so for me, talking to a friend also, and may not necessarily be every day, could be once in a while, is therapeutic because you're kind of sharing your lived experiences. And I think you still have to cope with it yourself because it's your own personal journey, but sharing it or talking about it just helps you cope better. So making it somebody else's problem doesn't mean that you don't have to cope with it. You'll still have to cope with it, but talking about it just helps you sometimes get a different perspective, helps you cope with it in a little bit of a different manner.
Thank you so much, Nija. I'm going to open this up to the audience, but that was really intimate, authentic. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Ms. Pallavi Jain to come up for the member interaction.
Is there anyone in the audience that would like to ask?
Yes. First question. Yes. The mic here.
So my question is, every other day I'm reading articles about kids finding confidence in AI. Like, this happens a lot in the West, in a lot of Asian countries as well. Do we see this happening in India? And if it is, how do we deal with it?
No, definitely. I mean, I think why only kids? I think a lot of us, I think, tend to do that. A lot of people I know resort to ChatGPT as their counselor. So, well, I think as a first level, it's not a bad idea because at least you're able to put some sense into what you're feeling. But you can't rely on AI as your final go-to doctor. So, and I would say that of course, digital intervention is a great tool because even as Empower, we can't reach out to so many people. It's not possible. So having a digital intervention definitely helps because at least your first level is filtered out. You know whether you need to seek help or you don't need to seek help. But after it's established that you need help, then you must go to a therapist because, the human contact and the human connect cannot be replaced by AI. I definitely do believe that, loneliness is one of the factors and one of the main things that we're going to be dealing with and we're already dealing with. So if you're going to completely replace even human connect with AI, then you're only exacerbating that issue of loneliness. So that can't be your final, I would not say that can be your final go-to, especially in case of therapy and mental health.
Thank you.
Hi, it was lovely hearing your talk. It's not really a question, but it's a thought, And from a story that you, Mrs. Nija, shared, that your son wanted to buy the book and said he would probably understand more about premenopause if you read about this, but don't you think all the conversations that's happening about mental health for women especially is focused on lady issues or lady problems, or for me to understand what I'm going through, the men who are mostly affected by what we go through at home and at work sort of drifted away or are not really aware because no one is talking to them about it. Don't you think it should be a part of their curriculum, either through business courses or through chats or topics or conversations or podcasts? But all the conversations are always for women forums. This is not something that's being discussed in men forums. And I think that's a conversation that probably you could change at your level if through Invisible Selves.
No,
or
what you're
through
saying is
anything else.
absolutely right. Men don't talk about their emotions as much. And especially, I think, the new generation of boys definitely do talk about it. It's a very open conversation with this generation of, say, my son, for example, and below. Because in schools, for example, we're talking about it all the time. So the children, for example, at our schools, even the boys and girls are talking about mental health issues all the time. So I think, but it will take little time for this next generation, for this new crop to come and talk about it. For the current crop of men, yes, it's a conversation that definitely should be happening because they just don't talk about it. And as an answer to what Empower can do, we are actually looking at, so our helpline, for example, obviously is open to all. And as to reiterate and to reconfirm what you're saying, most of our callers on the helpline are males actually. 70% are males. 70%. Yeah. Which actually exactly correlates and sort of reconfirms what you're saying, reaffirms it. But so at Empower, yes, we are going to be doing a mental health conference for men, for men's mental health. That is a topic that's definitely going to be looked into. Why have we not done it? Because I think, the women's issues are so much larger, unfortunately. It's just something that, is going to take time, but it's definitely a conversation that we have to have, and we do have it already in our own sort of ecosystems. To take it to a larger platform, yes, we will be doing that.
Yeah, and I think my point was
There's
for
a
men
question.
to understand.
Sorry, there's a question behind.
My name is Neena Rao, and thank you so much for sharing your personal account of how you got into this field, and your story resonated with mine so much. And so just as you started working in this field, I'm a mother of a child with autism, which is invisible autism. And post his late diagnosis, I also started an NGO that works for mental health and developmental disabilities focused on children. So in that context, I wanted to ask you your experience regarding how when you started this work, how did you get your daughter involved? When you started talking about her, she as an individual, what did she feel about it? Why I'm asking this question is because when I started telling my story, sharing my story with people, there were some friends around and family members who thought, why should you, your child doesn't look like he has any issues. So why let it be hidden? Let it not be told. You have to ask him first. And is he old enough, mature enough to say whether he wants his story to be told or not? So how did you come across that kind of an issue, and how did you deal with it?
Initially, I never spoke about it actually, because it was only fair for her to be comfortable to talk about her story first. So of course, as a caregiver, there's a tremendous amount of emotional load on you, because you have to obviously look after your child's health first. But there's a lot of trauma that you also go through as a caregiver, as a mom, especially if the support is very low. But you have to put your emotions aside and look after your child's first. And that's the role of every caregiver. I mean, nothing special for any one of us. It just is like that. So of course, what you go through, the emotional overload is a lot. But you have to respect because what your child is going through first, because she is the one who's going through it. Like in your case, he is actually going through it first. So he has to be comfortable talking about it. And I think we have to respect that. So until she was not ready to talk about it, I didn't speak about it. And even after she spoke about it, I didn't talk about it for a very long time because she needed to be comfortable in that space first. And it was much later, years later actually, I asked her again that now that you have started talking about it, would you want me to talk about it? Because it could also be that she's okay talking about it, but she's not okay me talking about it. And you have to respect that again. So after giving her that space, giving her that respect, asking her about it, when she said, no, I'm okay talking about it, is when I spoke about it.
Thank you.
One question. Thank you, ma'am, for answering all the questions with so much grace and also ensuring that there's a platform where I can sit and say that I'm the mom who had the postpartum depression. I had the baby with colic for like 2 years. And what I wanted to ask you is, I have 2 kids. Most of my friends do here as well. We always come back to the point where there is no alternative to time that a parent can spend with a child. Now, with the kind of work that we are doing, I run a marathon and we all do. From 7 o'clock, we are at it. And when we come back home at 6 or 7, we have that guilt. I haven't spent enough time. Can you give me a word of advice for moms like me?
I know. It's me too. Yes. I think guilt is our second name, middle name, if not the second. It's something that we grapple with on a daily basis. But I think it's a trade-off. So the way I look at it is that, again, every day is different, and I think you're making trade-offs on a daily basis. So sometimes your trade-off is where you go to attend to work, for example, or you have to, at certain times in the day, you have to look after your needs. And that's a trade-off, because then you're sort of at that time prioritizing. So say, for example, if I were to prioritize my workout, then I'm prioritizing my workout. And then at that time, if something else has to be sort of overlooked, then it has to be overlooked. But at another time, there's something of mine which then I let go of because something else needs to be prioritized. So I think that kind of trade-off is something that you're having to do on a daily basis. And I mean, I'm sort of coming to terms, with that, because when you look at your life in weeks, don't look at your life on a day. Look how much you've accomplished in a week, for example, or 2 weeks, and then find that balance and equilibrium.
I wanted to weigh in, if I may, just because Neerja said something which really mattered to me, and I've been a working mum all my life, and in fact, I had Tehelka at the same time as 2 children, one after the other with a 1.5 year gap. And Neerja, something that you said, because I did not live with guilt, and I feel particularly for women, whether you're a homemaker or you're a professional person, one is that if you have an identity of your own where you are happy and centered in who you are, one, that's a recipe for a consent, like people around you are happy because you're happy is one thing. And secondly, what Neerja said about being emotionally present, I think that's a very powerful phrase if we can all incorporate that. It's not so much about being physically there for your kids, because you could be fed up of just being like there for them and they become blind to you, but that you're emotionally present and they know that they are your priority in what, so like I'd wake up every day 6 o'clock, I'd put them on that bus. But then I was working and we had play dates and we did all that. But they knew, like they could feel that they were my sun and moon, you know. But I was doing other stuff, and they've grown up to respect a working mom, and they respect everybody else for having identities of their own, and that nobody is theirs. Like they don't have that sense of entitlement that someone's existence is only for me to be happy, So I think if all of us women can give ourselves that freedom, and yet, as Neerja said very wisely, like it's a revolving lens of when you're there for others and when you're there for yourself,
Yes.
So I just wanted to reiterate
And
that.
to add to that, I think also children then learn to respect and also want that identity for themselves.
Yes.
which then also becomes important because I also believe that children also pick up what they see, not so much what they hear.
Yeah.
So you could be telling them a lot of things, but if you're acting in a different manner, they're going to pick up the way you're acting. So if you act with respect, they will learn to respect also. But if you're just going to tell them that you have to respect me, but you don't respect them, they're not going to respect you back because, you know, they're picking up what they're seeing more than what they're hearing.
Thank you for addressing our questions so wonderfully, Mrs. Birla and Ms. Chaudhary. I request our YFlow Events Committee to get the autograph signed from our guest speaker.
I also want to give a shout out to Priyanka who put the fear of death in us. Priyanka, I saw the clock and I was like, my heartbeat got faster, you know.
Now I'd like to call the YFlow Treasurer, Ms. Rupal Bansal, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of our chairperson, Ms. Pallavi Jain, I'd like to thank each one of you for joining us today. A special thank you to our guest of honor, Ms. Nirja Birla and Ms. Shoma Chaudhary, for sharing such inspiring thoughts with us. Our heartfelt gratitude to our past chairs for their guidance, our committee for their constant efforts, and to all our members for your continued support. That keeps Flow growing stronger each year. A big thank you to our partners, Eternal Aesthetics, our premium diamond sponsor, Adore Label Marketing, our creative sponsor, The Voyager, our travel partner. Thank you once again for being a part of this wonderful afternoon. Please join us for lunch and have a lovely day ahead. Thank you.